Welcome to the Anthropology in Business podcast, where you'll learn about the many ways anthropology is applied in business and why business anthropology is one of the most effective lenses for making sense of organizations and consumers. Through conversations with leading anthropologists working in advertising, marketing, consumer behavior, organizational culture, user experience, and many other roles, you'll learn firsthand what it means to do business anthropology and how the work differs from academic anthropology. We'll discuss issues like the pace and depth of research in business, our visibility and influence as practitioners, and what we can do to build our brand. We will also focus on the value and impact of our research in business so that we can help business leaders understand why they should be hiring anthropologists. I'm your host, Matt Artz, a business anthropologist specializing in design anthropology and working at the intersection of product management, user experience, and business strategy. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Matt Artz of the Anthropology in Business podcast, which you'll now find in the American Anthropological Association's podcast library. I'm here today with Ainslee Hooper. Ainslee is an anthropologist from Australia, disability inclusion consultant, speaker, author, and the founder of Ainslee Hooper Consulting. So, Ainslee, thanks for joining me today. Would you mind by telling everybody how you got interested in anthropology?
Yeah, hi. So thanks for having me on the podcast. For me, my interest in anthropology, which I find is a very similar journey to everyone that I've met, was quite accidental. So I was working in the public service for 20 years at a call centre. And midway through that, I ended up in hospital and had a fair amount of time off due to being sick. And anyway, someone suggested to me, because I was afraid of my brain turning too much, why don't you pick up university or study something? And I was like, I didn't do that great in school, but I'll have a look. Anyway, so shortly I enrolled in a Bachelor of Arts, started doing a major in philosophy, found I really enjoyed that. So I started to look at other units, and I found a description of ASS 101, so the first anthropology unit. I looked at it, I was like, that looks actually really interesting, and something that all the kind of documentaries I used to like watching in social and cultural stuff. I thought, that's up my alley, so I took that. And within 5 minutes in the first lecture, I was just like, yes, that's exactly what I want to do for the rest of my life. So, basically continued on studying my Bachelor of Arts part-time. And so I started that in 2005, and then I resigned from my call centre job in 2019. During that time, I'd gone on to study my honours in anthropology. And after resigning from that job, I started up my own consultancy, Ainslee Hooper Consulting, where I consult for businesses around disability inclusion.
Good. Thanks for sharing that. So you are the first person at least who's living in Australia at the time of me interviewing them. And I guess the previous guest who spent time in Australia didn't necessarily speak about this so much. So I'm just kind of curious. Could you tell us, since most of the listeners of the show are in the States, could you tell us more about what anthropology in Australia looks like? Is it very applied or not? Did you get any kind of sense of, practicing while you're in your program, or is it more traditional?
Yeah. So for me, I studied at Deakin University in Geelong in Australia. And the focus of the anthropology program is at Deakin is very much social and cultural anthropology. And through the honours degree, we didn't actually have any kind of hands-on experience out in the field. So my consulting is the first time I've been using it out in the field. So it was basically because I don't know what it's like in the States, but when you're studying, but in Australia, the ethics process is just really, really convoluted and can take ages. Things come back and forth. So they were discouraging us from doing anything that's going to involve human participants or anything like that. So, so that's basically like the academic side of it. In regards to what it looks like outside of academia, so in Australia, originally my goal when I first started studying, my goal was to get my PhD because I loved studying anthropology so much, and I wanted to continue studying and basically just get paid to do research. So my goal was to get my PhD so I could then get a job at the university and do that, and obviously teach anthropology as well. Unfortunately, things have anthropology's taken a fair hit in Australia. There's a lot of universities where the anthropology has been taken out, especially over in Western Australia. They've taken out anthropology completely, and that's because the government just doesn't see the value in the arts, which is really disappointing. So based on that and the fact that finding a job in anthropology at universities is it's not as secure as it used to be. It used to be like the dream kind of job. Now a lot of people are on short-term contracts, on casual contracts, etc. So the focus really is on now getting. Sorry, my earphone just fell out. I'm just going to put that back in. Yeah, sorry. So, yeah. Okay, now it's back in. All right. So, yeah, the focus is basically on anthropology outside of academia. In regards to the kind of jobs in Australia, native title is a big area for people, for anthropologists. Native title is looking at the land in regards to Aboriginal ownership and determining who owns the land and assisting with Aboriginal people claiming that native title back from the government. So there's that. And then there's also obviously the anthropologists working in marketing, that kind of thing. For me, as I have a disability, for me, trying to find that, I found once I got out of academia, I found that there wasn't many opportunities for anthropological jobs in my area. I'd have to travel to Melbourne, which is about an hour away, and having a disability just made it really difficult. So that's how I ended up going into consulting and just finding jobs for myself.
Got it. Yeah, thanks. And just a quick, maybe a few follow-up questions. So you said that anthropology is sort of being, defunded, I guess, in academia. And now it seems like maybe more people are realizing they need to practice outside of academia. Before that started happening, was there many anthropologists working in business?
In business, at the time, I actually hadn't even looked at anthropology in business until the idea of the Institute of Anthropology in academic institutions became less and less attractive. That's only when I started to look outside and go, okay, so how else can it be applied? And so in Australia, there seems to be more consulting for consulting anthropologists rather than actually getting hired as business anthropologists for particular organisations.
Got it. So you're working as a disability inclusion consultant. So why, I guess, why did you want to run your own company, really? I mean, I know you said you were, why you were interested in the topic, but why did you want to really jump in and do it yourself?
Because I couldn't find any jobs around me. this is the thing. Once you get the, I'm sure as you know, once you get the anthropology bug, that's basically it. But yeah, I couldn't find any jobs around me that utilised my experience as an anthropologist, and obviously I didn't want to travel. So yeah, basically I was like, okay, so I know how beautiful anthropology is and what it can do when it's utilised and how it can help people affect. This is what it does for me. It helps people see things through other people's eyes, and that for me there was two things. So there was wanting to do that, but I guess I have to backtrack a little bit because even before that 2019, I basically, being a person with a disability, I sort of obviously got a bit of an insight into things that I can see that weren't working in society, that like gaps that where we're still not being not on an equal footing with everybody else, and we're missing out on things. And it doesn't have to be that way, and it comes through people just like it comes through things like privilege, where people don't have to actually see the barriers because they're not faced with the barriers, those kind of things. So for me, I really wanted to help businesses tap into the disability, the disability market, I guess, consumers with disabilities, and find ways to make their businesses more inclusive so that consumers can have the same experience as everybody else. So that was my focus, and that's the reason why, as I said, I couldn't find any jobs that really ticked any of the boxes for me. So that's why I decided to start doing it myself.
And so how has that experience been so far?
It was very hard at the beginning, very hard. Basically, I've learned along the way to shut up about the anthropology side of things a fair bit, because even though we like it, people don't care about it, and that was hard at the beginning. I was like, okay, well, people have got to know why it's so good, but yeah, I've learned to keep that quiet, and so yeah, I do. I basically all I say to businesses, I'm just wanting to help consumers. I want to help create a more disability inclusive experience for the consumers, and obviously businesses want to be able to do that as well. So that is getting more people on board. So as a consultant, though, it's hard. Like obviously you go through ebbs and flows with clients. So it's a hard slog, but yeah, absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny that you made that comment, because it comes up so frequently, about really knowing your audience, knowing that you could talk about anthropology and when you can. And more often than not, it seems like most people are saying that we don't have those kind of conversations, especially not at the beginning. Maybe you get to sprinkle that in a little later, after you have some rapport.
Yeah, because I remember like being, I could go to an anthropology conference and just like be an absolute high by the end of it, because obviously talking about anthropology, and yeah, then I go into a setting that people are like, well, what the hell's an anthropologist anyway? And then you start talking about it, and their eyes glaze over because they're like, they're not interested. And it's like, why aren't you interested? What am I saying wrong? I'm not explaining this properly to you, why it's so beautiful. So basically, I mean, in my role, what I basically do is I take elements from anthropology, the toolbox. So I do a lot of qualitative research. I think that's probably the most common thing that I do throughout, because my consulting is all. But prior to the pandemic, I actually set my business up so that I wouldn't have to be travelling too much. So I've only actually, out of all the consults that I've only had 2 on-site consults. So it's all basically online. So it's very much qualitative research and doing a lot of interviewing with clients, and clients, and I look at a lot of boards, so like boards within organisations and committees, and interviewing those people on those boards and committees to make sure that, basically the disability inclusion element is being met.
Got it. And so, you said you're using the methods, but I guess I'd ask the question, does any of the theory come into the work, or at least do you get to make that present in any way?
Unfortunately, not so far. And so that's another part. I've had to learn to I've had to learn to adapt to what the clients obviously. I haven't actually gone into. I see a lot of stuff on LinkedIn about business anthropology, where talking about organizational culture and all that kind of stuff. So that kind of thing I haven't got into as yet. I'm sort of more, from the ground up, looking at the consumer, and which will eventually feed up to the top. But most of my interactions are just consumer and consumer focused. So the theory part of it hasn't sort of come into it too much as yet.
And from the consumer perspective, what are the businesses interested in? Are they interested in, the way they present the brand, or the way they design products? What kind of work are we?
So we're looking at the experiences that the consumers are having within that business. So it's I'm not so much. I haven't worked in regards to anything to do with products at this stage. It's all been about the human experience. So, for example, when they go into a business and they're utilising a business, what is it that they can't do? What is it that they can do? And what is it that they would need to then make that experience effectively on an equal footing to someone without a disability. So I always ask the consumer, the business, what's the experience that you would like your consumers to have? And when they say that the people with disability, the consumers with disabilities need to have that same experience, and looking at what the gaps are that are preventing that from happening.
Got it. And so some of that presumably is, involves the built environment, but obviously also, there's, it would seem to me that there's, likely employee training questions that come up as well, which I appreciate gets closer into the organizational side maybe. But so is it more kind of built environment, or is it, more in the way employees are treating consumers?
Yeah, so it's been interesting. So for me, I stay away from, when I stay away, I don't deal with the built environment as much, because the built environment, there's so much legislation that's involved in that. I will point out to a business that there is a problem with, for example, I will say to the business, look, these consumers are unable to access this area of the building, for example, but I'm not going to go and say, okay, so this is the solution that needs to be done, because I don't deal with that. That's an access consultant, and there's so much legislation involved. I just don't deal with that. So for me, it's more about, okay, so, and this is the other thing that I've found as well, is that when you talk to businesses about accessibility, red flags go up for them, because they think, okay, this is going to be way too expensive. We don't want to deal with this. No thanks. And so talking about disability inclusion, which obviously embraces more than accessibility, that when businesses start to see people wanting to access things, so because of how it makes them feel when they can do so, that then taps into them wanting to do more to improve things. One of my recent contracts involved research looking at a gallery and what the consumer's experiences were with that gallery. What it then also involved was talking to the staff and volunteers about what things that they noticed as well. And it was interesting because there was a lot of people who said, oh, we don't feel confident with such and such. And it was due to the lack of training, or they may not have been around when the training was happening. So there's a lot of issues that can be solved when it comes down to the human experience. So the built environment issues sort of seem to be very minimal in comparison to what the human experience is.
And what would you say, is there any trends that pop out, as you're talking about with the human experience? So is there any trends that you pop out that you see across, most companies that you work with, that, anybody listening should be aware of and should be thinking about addressing in their own organizations?
Yeah, the biggest thing is the lack of knowledge about, it really depends on the industry, but there's, I guess, a couple of the themes that sort of pop up across all industries is communication. So a lot of non-disabled people still don't know how to confidently communicate with a person with a disability. And a lot of it is to do with the fact that in the disability services industry, for example, which is one of the areas that I consult in, there's a thing in Australia called Certificate for Disability, and it's what people study before they go out and get jobs in the disability sector. In that particular industry, that particular course, there's a lot of theory, and so it's a lot of reading about people with disabilities, but there's no actual face-to-face interaction with the person with the disability necessarily. So they're reading this stuff, they're reading these two-dimensional examples of what a person with disability is, etc. And so when they're actually going out into the workforce and communicating with people, there's this disjoint, because the real experience is completely different to what's in the book. So there's that one. So I would say that's probably the biggest one that comes across the whole thing, is there's that, but then also, when it comes to talking about the gallery, for example, people with disabilities, depending on the disability, will be accessing the pieces of artwork in different ways. For example, the people that have devices where they can hold it up to the artwork, and that device will explain to them what that particular artwork looks like. And obviously there's rules in galleries where you can't take photos. So some volunteers who may not realise that that's actually a device to help a person see will think that that's a camera, and they'll be like, no, you can't use that. And then obviously, that then makes that person with a disability, it could potentially make them feel uncomfortable, not wanting to go back to that kind of setting. So there's always, it's really about awareness and understanding the person with a disability.
Yeah, as you were responding there, I was starting to think of the word education. You had started with talking about communication, which I can see, why that's important and why it's, a shortcoming of today. But then as you continued on and you gave the example from the gallery, what really popped out at me was, the thought that how do you go about educating a whole organization, to have the experience to communicate well?
So there's something that I've found recently through my business, and I find is a really good way of effectively cracking this, is that, there are so many stereotypes that exist and about people with disabilities. And recently, this is a really good example, I think, that sort of where my personal life and my business life came together and sort of showed how we can break down how we can address these issues. And to me, it's really about people with disabilities being seen doing things. So and that then people go, okay, so that's, what inclusion really looks like. So recently, I do strength sports. Competed recently in a strongman competition, and that through doing that, because I know disabled strongman in America and the UK is really big. It's not so much in Australia. It's not so big in Australia. But people being able to see a person with a disability doing something that they don't expect them to be able to do, actually it makes a lot of people aware, okay, well, maybe my bias, my prejudice, maybe I have these things I didn't even realise I did. So that's a really good way of helping people I think if businesses can help people with disabilities be seen, that's really going to help the breaking things down. A lot of the training that I find in Australia, especially when I was working for the government for 20 years in the public service, a lot of the training was e-learning packages. So talking about people with disabilities on a computer screen, like that's, to me, that's not really a great way of learning. Talking to people, having people with real lived experience, talking to staff, that is probably the best way of breaking these things down. But yeah, for me, absolutely, the whole thing, like even in Australia, there's a new legal ad that's come up in Australia, and I don't, you guys have probably already had it already, the Together We're Better. Have you seen that one?
No, I haven't.
So it's really interesting. It's got people with disabilities, so children with disabilities, children of different colours, races, religion, whatever, and all together. So I think being that it's the visible, people will read things. People will, if people just read things, they're not going to get it. But if they actually get to see examples of it and see it actually happening, that's when I think people get on board with it.
It's quite a big task. And so what are you thinking in terms of, your plans for the organization? Are you thinking, aside from like the human experience component that you're talking about, are you interested, I know you briefly said you might be interested in moving kind of upstream to organizational issues. What other areas in the sort of anthropological consulting space interest you?
So for me, I guess being a solo consultant, I'm still very small fish. So the whole organisational thing. I've only all the businesses that I've dealt with have all been small businesses, and I've very rarely dealt with the large organisation. The large, actually, no, I lied. A couple of large organisations I dealt with, but it was on a small scale. I was dealing with a particular group within that organisation and just dealing with that particular issue that they were having. So it wasn't like a across the organisation thing. For me, coming from working in government and working in, and I guess this is it, yeah. So and now that we're talking about it, I think this is why I sort of haven't gone into that direction yet. Working in the government for 20 years, it was a toxic workplace environment, and so for me, that was because, for example, in my particular situation, HR didn't have a clue what was going on in my workplace. And it's a national organisation, obviously, And so I find that, if it's too big, it's too hard to deal with because you can't keep track of everything that's going on in your organisation. So therefore, that's why I'm very much focused on consumers and I guess in my own area, looking at the consumers and keeping it small scale.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly it would seem like you can have a lot more influence at that level.
Yeah, I think so. That's it. I'm very much grassroots. When I studied anthropology, it was very much the grassroots stuff that really interested me more than the big organisation side of things. I was very much interested in how anthropology can help the little guy and the people who don't have a voice.
So to that point, you have your own podcast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you speak quite a bit on, other podcasts and I see you sort of quite active on LinkedIn. And so if you were to summarize, what are you trying to do with all those efforts?
So with my podcast, I've taken a break from. So I did one season. I will be relaunching the second season this year. The purpose of that podcast so far has been about breaking down the barriers of, like what I was talking about with that certificate for, like textbook examples of people with disabilities. In that particular podcast, interviewing people with disabilities to show that we're more than the stereotype that people think we are, and that we're doing different things to what people think we are, etc. So that was the first season. The second season, I did the start last year talking about COVID-19 disability, but obviously with things with the PhD, it got a bit too murky in regards to ethics, so I decided to put that on hold. And this year, I'll basically just be going back to raising awareness and looking and talking about, my focus with this one will be talking about the, I guess, not so much the experience of COVID, but in regards to accessibility and inclusion, and what the lessons that we can take away from COVID-19 in regards to inclusion and taking that forward. So that's there. And then, with LinkedIn, obviously, my purpose being on LinkedIn is, again, just to raise awareness and for me, like, I call myself a disability inclusion consultant. I'm not when people see that, they think inclusion in regards to like HR, that kind of stuff. And for me, I'm not really concerned about, I don't play in the employment space for people with disabilities, as I've basically been saying here. It's all about the consumer. So looking at how can businesses provide that inclusive experience for their consumers. So, that's my purpose on LinkedIn, just to keep promoting that and getting people on board with that idea.
So 2 questions based on what you just said there. One, I'm curious to know, across all those channels, have you found anything that works really well to raise awareness, particularly, to people like, outside, of the community, in the sense of like, I find, I'm going to use my own example here, whereas I find that I oftentimes am speaking like about anthropology to anthropologists, and, that's good. It's like when we go to an anthropology conference, right? It's great. We get to see people we know and talk to others that we don't know, and we get to learn and share. But it's also sometimes like a room of us telling, like, anthropology is great, and everybody say, yeah, it's wonderful. And we often need to kind of move, to work on awareness outside of the circle of anthropology, because what we really need is employers and companies to hire, to hire employees or consultants, whatever it may be. So what have you found that really works to build, awareness, just across any of those channels?
For me, it's been about storytelling. So it's interesting because, like, at the beginning, I was always like, it's not about me. It's not about me. It's about, people with disabilities across the board. But then I learned, well, actually, no, I need to be telling my story and sharing my experiences, because obviously that's where I can tap into the emotional side and bring that out. And that's what I find people have actually really resonated with. They've resonated with like hearing about how things have affected, like just quickly talking about that example of the strength sports that I've gotten into. I shared a story on LinkedIn the other day, and it was to me that particular, because it was a perfect example of inclusion and what I want businesses to be doing. So basically the short of it was that it was a competition, and I've always watched this kind of sport but never actually participated in it because being in a wheelchair couldn't do it. But then there's a guy who's got been awarded Australian of the Year, Dylan Alcott, and he's a wheelchair tennis player. And he, so basically he started this thing called Sport for All, which is about making sports inclusive for people with disabilities. Short of it is that my coach actually caught on to the program, and she messaged me and she said, "Hey, I'm running this competition next month. Would you like to compete?" And I'm like, yes, please, because I thought, wow, yeah. So I was the only disabled person competing in this particular competition. But yeah, so I went along and competed. We had no idea how it was going to play out. It was just basically, I was the guinea pig, and I was completely fine with that. But then people actually saw the competition, and I ended up getting contacted by somebody else, and they said, "We're running a competition next month. If we made an all abilities category, would you like to compete?" And I was just like, "Yes, please." And then from there, more people with disabilities are actually competing in the competition. So that's an example of people seeing what's actually possible, then going ahead and adapting it to their own business. And it didn't cost a damn thing, so that to me, so sharing those kind of stories and what it meant to me on a personal level, like on a mental health level, I actually got a response from that on LinkedIn. People were going, okay, wow, we actually can see what disability inclusion does on a human experience level. And so continuing those conversations and talking about what it actually does. It can be mentally taxing at times, especially when you're talking and there's little action being taken. But yeah, it definitely helps to move the story along and get people slowly on board with the idea.
It's a great example, so I'm glad you brought it up. Now, the other thing you had said prior to my last question, you mentioned how you've been talking about what was learned during COVID, and how we need to remember, maybe I guess this is my words, but the things we need to remember and potentially do differently in the future to make sure that people with disabilities are treated appropriately, I guess, even out of the pandemic, but of course if we go into another, right, and but of course just even outside of that. And so what were the main things that you learned, I guess, if you could share them, aside from the fact that you already mentioned, services were shut down, right, which seems like a drastic kind of oversight on the part of the government. But what else came out of it that maybe just, I'm not aware of or others are not aware of? Okay.
So I guess I'll talk to you a little bit about that particular medical thing that I came across during the literature search. So, so this isn't just COVID, this is across the board, which is quite scary. And these kind of things are why disability inclusion is so important, making people aware. And yet bringing awareness to disability is so important so people can see just that. It's funny, I've had so many conversations with people going, oh, we must be so progressive, moving towards disability inclusion? It's like, well, actually, no, because in that particular medical journal instance, there's 3 guidelines that they use when it comes to that last piece of life-saving equipment. There's 3 guidelines that they use. So, say for example, if you and I were like laying on a bed, we're both like, not able to talk because we're sick as hell with COVID, but there's one last piece of equipment available, you will get that equipment because you don't have a disability, because they look at things like social utility. So, for example, what is a person with a disability going to contribute to society against somebody without a disability? So neither of us are able to talk to defend ourselves. Me having the disability, that's like a cross against me. And there's the other one is underlying health conditions. The assumption that people with disabilities all have underlying health conditions. So therefore, saving a person with a disability is pretty stupid in the eyes of the medical field compared to somebody without. So there was those things. But I guess the other surprising part, I'm just trying to think of other things that I guess it's having a disability yourself. You don't get surprised by much that you see. So, and then you forget that. I found the thing that I found was that obviously I was internalizing all this stuff. But yeah, people without disabilities don't know, and I'm just trying to think of things that. Because I think a lot of the stuff I hadn't actually talked about, because I just sort of kept it in my own head because, not being able to deal with it. So, but I think I do know, like, I'm trying to think. So I know, like, conferences, for example, with the conference, I had a lot of friends during COVID who were obviously able to present more at conferences because of the fact that they were all online. And then once those conferences all went back to normal, they were like, no, we can't offer you remote, etc., because it'd be too hard. I think basically the biggest thing was that all of these things that were coming into play, and this is probably the biggest thing, all the things like remote working, the Zoom, doing everything online, even like in my local area, for example, Uber Eats. Like as soon as COVID hit, there was like so many Uber Eats options that had not been there before. So all these kind of things that people with disabilities had been fighting for, all of these things for like years and years and years, and finally pandemic hits and it's all possible. So that's probably the biggest thing, is that we had been wanting all this stuff for years, and everyone, all the businesses were saying no, sorry, not possible, too expensive, blah blah. But finally, because it affected them, they're like, yep, okay, we can do it now. So I think that's probably the biggest thing.
Well, let's hope they keep doing it. And so for anybody who's interested in working with you or learning more about what you do, is there any particular place that you'd like them to get in touch with you?
Yeah, so LinkedIn, Ainslee Hooper. I've also got my company page on there, Ainslee Hooper Consulting, or my website, ainsleyhooper.com.au. They're the 2 places to get me, absolutely. And
do you have anything coming up that you want people to know about?
So at the moment, I am just I'm currently working on a couple of things, so I can't say exactly what at the moment, but this year's looking exciting.
Oh, that's great to hear. Well, Ainslee, thanks very much for taking the time. It was really great to chat with you. And
thank you for having me on.
Yeah, my pleasure. Look forward to chatting again in the future. Thanks. Thank you for listening to the Anthropology in Business podcast. To learn everything you need to break into business anthropology and why business anthropology is one of the best lenses for contributing to business success, Visit my website at mattartz.me, where I cover many topics related to business anthropology and beyond. There you will find all the podcast episodes, blogs, and news. Please like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.